Evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Wednesday evening session for PPA 660 Organization Theory. It was good seeing everyone on Saturday, and I appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your Saturday morning to go over the syllabus and some of the course requirements so that we can get all that out of the way so that we can hit the ground running for this evening. So, the way in which I have this evening session envisioned is that the primary topic we're going to talk about tonight will be our introduction to organization theory. So, we're going to broach questions such as how do we study organizations? Why do we study organizations? What is the importance of having a body of knowledge that studies public organizations as opposed to just private sector organizations? Some of the characteristics and some of the factors that can make it difficult for us to take pre-existing private organization theories and models and apply those theories and models to our public organizations. We will talk about that in the first part of class tonight. I will also then walk you through again the three main characteristics that Jonathan Tompkins uses in the textbook to compare all these different theories and schools of thought to each other. So we'll walk through in detail the four models of organizational effectiveness, and we'll be using those models to kind of, again, differentiate between our different theories, which theories emphasize achievement of goals as the primary measure of organizational effectiveness. Which of our theories will emphasize the internal processes and having efficient and well-controlled internal processes as a measure of effectiveness, and so on and so on. So we'll talk about those four main models of organizational effectiveness. Then we'll talk about the second characteristic that we'll be using throughout our class together, and those are these mechanisms for coordination and control of work activities. And then we'll talk about our third characteristic that we'll be using throughout the course, which will be the motivational strategies. And I'll reintroduce you to those four different motivational strategies again. And again, those are those three characteristics that we will use every time we finish talking about a theory or a school of thought to kind of give us a little bit of rhyme and reason to understand that school of thought and how that school of thought truly differs from some of the schools of thought that may have come before it and some of the schools of thought that may have come after it. So we'll do that in the first part of class tonight, and then that will lead us up into our evening break. Then after our evening break, I have some breakout room activity for us that we can take a look at. We'll break up into a few breakout rooms, and then you'll have about 30 or so minutes to work on the prompt that I'll provide for you. When we're done with our breakout rooms, we'll then reconvene as a class, and then we'll have each one of the rooms share out what you came up with and kind of, again, compare the similarities and differences between the thought process of each of the different rooms. Once we are finished with that tonight, we will then go back and reassess our time, and we'll see how much time we have remaining. If we do have an ample amount of time remaining, we may work ahead a little bit and actually start to introduce some of the classical theorists that we have scheduled to talk about next Monday. But again, we'll play that by ear. We'll see how quickly we progress through our information and see if we do have the luxury this evening of being able to work ahead a little bit. So let me go ahead and share the slideshow with you, and let's go ahead and just do some of these foundational types of topics on organization theory. You may, if you majored in public administration at the undergraduate level, you may have already had an organization theory course. If you were a business major at the undergraduate level, you may have also had an organization theory course. Beyond that, we don't see a whole lot of undergraduate treatment of organization theory. And so some of this information for some of you may ring very familiar. For some of you, it may not be all that familiar at all. Some of this information that we're going to talk about in this class with these theorists may also sound familiar to you from your PPA 500 course. Most of our sections of PPA 500 will have at least 1 week that will be devoted to a discussion of public organizations, organization theory, and organization behavior. So at least you hopefully got a little introduction to a lot of these theories we'll talk about over our next 6 weeks together, or 4 weeks together, I guess it is. But we will really get into a lot more detail with these theorists, and we'll really, as I like to say, put a lot more flesh on the bones with the discussion of these organization theorists. So let's go ahead and just get started with this very basic question of what is organization theory? We study organizations for specific reasons. Oftentimes, when we are studying organizations, we are doing it from a somewhat scientific type of a framework. So we study phenomena from a scientific framework. We're oftentimes studying that phenomena for the purpose of trying to develop theories and models that will help us understand that phenomena in the future and in other types of settings. So in the social sciences, in the natural sciences, kind of irrespective of what specific discipline you're dealing with, those disciplines usually focus on the formulation of theories and models. Now, I'm sure you've all had a research methods course before, so you are familiar with theories and models. Theories are more abstract than models. So what a theory will do is it will postulate a relationship between abstract concepts. So we'll have abstract concepts that we all kind of have an idea of what they are and what they mean, but they're relatively difficult for us to measure because we do not have good, clear operational definitions of what those abstract constructs are. But our theory will just link together relationships between these abstract concepts. And that's kind of what a theory is. We then take those abstract theories and we distill them into more specific research models. So for those abstract concepts and constructs that we have in our theory, we'll take each one of those abstract concepts and we will then distill it into a simpler, easier to measure variable. And once we have taken those concepts and we have transformed them into measurable variables with operational definitions, then when we postulate the relationship between those measurable variables, that is what we usually refer to as a research model. So when we're talking organization theory, we are typically talking at the theoretical level. So we're kind of talking at that 30,000-foot type of helicopter level when we are talking about how our organizations function. So what we do in organization theory is we kind of develop and analyze these relatively abstract constructs and the relationship between these abstract constructs. So when we apply these theories to our public organizations and nonprofit organizations as well, organization theory really is about the study of the structure of these organizations. So when we study public organizations, we are going to study how they are structured. We're going to study their organization chart. We're going to study the units and divisions and departments within that organization. So we're going to have very much of a structural type of a focus. When we study organizations from a structural focus, this is somewhat akin to the political science literature. And if you happen to take political science classes undergrad, or you got your undergraduate degree in political science, you may be familiar with this, but the political science literature went through an evolution where it went through different phases of how it studied political phenomena. The traditional approach to political science was the institutional approach. In that traditional institutional approach, primarily important in the 1940s and 1950s, you were really looking at the institution itself. So you would study the institution of Congress. You would study the institution of the Supreme Court. You would study the institution of the office of the president. But you're studying at the institutional type of level. So that's one way in which we can study organizations and develop theories of organization structure at that institutional type of level. Another reason why we study organization theory is to better understand the behaviors of all the component elements within an organization. So that could be the behavior of individual employees, individual human beings. We can study the behaviors of departments and divisions and units. So we actually kind of deconstruct the organization from its institutional level into its component parts. We then study the behavior of all those component parts. So it's a study of behaviors. This is akin to the political science literature in the 1960s and 70s, which was very much of a behavioralist approach. So we saw the literature in political science shift from an institutional approach to a behavioralist approach in the 60s and 70s. So instead of studying the institution of Congress, we would study Congress by studying individual members of Congress. And I know in your policy class, I don't know how much you talked about John Kingdon, but John Kingdon is a very well-known theorist who actually developed a theory to explain why individual members of Congress make the voting decisions that they make. And Kingdon actually put together this very elaborate flow chart that actually spanned 2 pages, where he had a flow chart that if this member of Congress fit this criteria, then they would take this type of action. If they fit this criteria, then they would take another type of action. And then this flow chart with all this series of arrows would then show you that based upon all these different characteristics in the context of the situation, how a specific member of Congress could be predicted to vote on a specific type of an issue. That is very much of a behavioralist type of approach. And in this course, you're going to see that behavioralist type of approach, especially when we talk about our neoclassical schools of organization theory. So our human relations and our human resource management types of schools. So the second way to study organizations is by studying the behaviors that go on within those organizations. A third way that we can study organizations is by studying the relationship between the organization and its incumbent members. So how do the members of the organization relate with the institution? How does the institution relate with the members of the organization? This is similar to the third era of political science literature that was known as the post-behavioralist period. So in the post-behavioralist period, we were asking questions about how individual members of the House interacted with the rules and the processes in the House itself. So we were looking at this relationship between the member and the institution. So we'll also do that here in organization theory. We'll be very concerned, especially in human resource management theory, not just about what the organization can get out of the individual employee, but what can the individual employee get out of the organization through their participation as an employee within that organization. So the relationship becomes very much a two-way street between employees and their organization. So looking at those relationships, that is a third way in which we will see we study public organizations. And then the fourth way we can study public organizations is to study the external pressures that are being applied to these organizations by that organization's external environment. So here again, we have this two-way street where environments can affect the organization and the organization can then affect its external environment. Clearly, external environments can affect organizations through the availability of a well-trained labor pool that they can hire from, through appropriations, through grant funding, through political support, through constituent group support, a lot of resources that organizations can contribute to, or to that environments can contribute to organizations. And then clearly organizations can also have an impact upon their external environment as well. The types of outputs that organizations create, those products and those goods and those services, can certainly have a major impact upon the external environment. You think of something such as a vaccination program. So you have a vaccination program. that is providing vaccinations for the children from households that are below a certain income threshold. Well, there, at least essentially, will be benefits from this vaccination program. We'll have all these, what we call in economics, positive externalities, all these positive consequences. That if you have more children getting this vaccine, if that vaccine does indeed prevent illness, it will then help prevent illness among people who are not even receiving that vaccine, but live in the community in that external type of environment. You think about an income subsidy program, so a general assistance program where a state government is providing money directly to income eligible families to try and increase their disposable income. Well, there's a relationship there in that the organization that is providing for this general assistance program and actually providing these direct cash transfers into family accounts, what they are doing is they are increasing the disposable income of those families. By increasing that disposable income, there's more money going into the economy, and small businesses, and sometimes large businesses in that external environment will benefit from those policies that are being implemented by that public organization. So those are four different ways in which we can view organization theory. They are not mutually exclusive. And as we go through our discussion of the chronological development of public organization literature, we will see all these four different definitions of organization theory embedded within all, or at least most of the theories and most of the schools of thought that we will be talking about. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about organization theory. Building upon that, we then also know that there are different ways we can view our organizations. The first way we can view our organizations when we study them is what we call the macro level approach. So this is that organizational approach. We focus on the organization itself as an institution. How is the organization organized? What does its organizational chart look like? What does the organization structure look like? And then what does its organization then mean for the outputs and the outcomes of that given organization? And again, probably up to this point in the MPA program, you've probably talked about these terms, outputs and outcomes, before. The output is what the organization is actually producing. So the goods, the services, the products, if they're producing products, those are considered to be the outputs of the organization. So it's what you are creating on a daily basis. Then the outcomes are going to be those long-term consequences of those outputs. My favorite question is always, so what? So you're producing this output. So you are delivering these services to your beneficiaries. Well, the so what question is, how do those services then benefit those beneficiaries? So the outcomes will be the long-term consequences of these outputs that are being created on a daily basis by the organization. So we look at what the organization structure means for both the outputs on a daily basis, as well as the long-term outcomes, the consequences for the people who will be consuming these daily outputs. This macro level, institutional level approach, we see that a lot from people like Max Weber, that first classical theorist that we are going to focus on here in this class in the Classical School of Organization Theory. So some theorists will take this macro level approach. Other theorists will view organizations from a micro level. So in the micro level, they will then get into the component elements of that organization. So they're going to look at the individual employees in that organization. They're going to look at the units and divisions, the informal and formal groups within those organizations. These are the theories that really start to really treat organizations more as being social environments rather than just technical environments. So at the macro level approach, a lot of those classical theorists looked at the organization from very much a technical structural type of a perspective. The micro level theorists, like the neoclassical theorists that we will be studying this semester, they will look at it much more from the not the structural approach, but much more the social approach. So how do we motivate employees? How do we allow employees to participate in their own self-governance, like with a Mary Parker Follett? What types of transactional incentives do we need to provide for our employees, like in a Chester Barnard type of approach? How important groups are, how people function in groups, and what the presence of groups means for our outputs as well as our outcomes, much like an Elton Mayo would look at. So that's the micro level approach, looking at the components within the organization. Then the third approach is the management-based approach. And when we view organization theory from a management-based approach, we are trying to understand the processes, and the policies, and the practices that are going on in the organization on a daily basis, and then hoping to develop theories that will allow those processes and those procedures to be more effective and more efficient. Now, again, the macro, the micro, and the management-based approach are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but we tend to see these approaches used differently in different schools of thought. Macro level tends to be much more classical. Micro level tends to be much more neoclassical. Management tends to be kind of a mixture of the two. So as we go through our time together in this class, what we are going to do, as I told you on Saturday, is we are going to take a chronological view of the evolution of public organization literature. So we are going to start in the late 1800s with classical theorists like Max Weber, and then look at how the literature has evolved over the past 150 years. So as we do that, we are going to be examining different schools of thought. And Tompkins, as I told you on Saturday, I like the textbook. The one reason is because of this chronological type of an approach. So Tompkins will walk you through all these different schools of thought. I sometimes will take some of these schools of thought and combine them together if they share a lot of the same types of ideas and a lot of the same types of themes. So, for instance, the first school of thought that you're exposed to in the Tompkins textbook is the classic bureaucratic school, Max Weber school of the ideal bureaucracy. That is very much of a classical type of view. It is a view that even though it has a lot of detractors and a lot of the neoclassical theories were developed as responses to the limitations and criticisms associated with Weber's classical school, we still see a lot of vestiges of Max Weber in our modern day organizations. But that's where we'll start with classic bureaucratic theory and Max Weber. We then move into the School of Scientific Management. Scientific management, I tend to include within this overall rubric of the classical school, because the scientific management school of Frederick Taylor shares so many themes and so many objectives with Max Weber that it kind of makes sense to discuss them together kind of as part of the same movement. But Tompkins refers to that as scientific management. We'll talk about that as we talk about our classical school. The third school that's presented to you is the Administrative Management and Principal School with people like Fayol and Mooney and Gulick. Here with the Administrative Management and Principal School, I tend to also group those under the classical rubric because they share some of the same types of themes and some of the same types of goals and objectives. So when we really start talking about classical theories in earnest, whether it be at the later part of class tonight or next Monday, those are the theories and theorists that we are going to be focusing on. Weber, Taylor, Fayol, Mooney, Gulick. Those are who we are going to consider to be the true classical types of theorists. From a chronological perspective, Weber, late 1800s into the early 1900s. Taylor was pretty much a contemporary, so he was writing at the same point in time, late 1800s into the early 1900s. And then with Feo and Mooney and Gulick, we're moving into the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. So that's kind of the period we're looking at, late 1800s until the 1930s and 1940s. And that is our what we consider to be our classical type of school of organization theory. Then the fourth school of thought that's presented to you in Tompkins is the human relations school. And the way in which Tompkins handles it is a little bit differently than the way in which I handle it, in that he handles these schools of thought chronologically. So he will present to you, here's the human relations school with people like pre-human relations theorists like Mary Parker Follett, human relations theorists such as Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and Chester Barnard. And those will be what he considers to be his human relations theorists. And then several chapters later on, because it's chronological, he then introduces you to the human resource management theorists. So that's where you get people like McGregor and Maslow and Argyris and Herzberg. So he separates them into separate chapters. I kind of group them together. So I will group human relations theory together with human resource management theory, kind of as under this rubric of neoclassical theories. So we're going to deal with all those folks kind of together. When we're looking at human relations theorists, we're talking about from the 1920s with Mary Parker Follett up through the 1950s with people like Elton Mayo and Chester Barnard. Then when we start talking about human resource management theory, that's when we're starting in the 1960s up to the contemporary period of time. And that's where we get people like Maslow and McGregor and Argyris and so on. So those would be kind of our neoclassical types of schools. Then the next school of thought here is the systems school. The systems school starts to look beyond the walls of the organization. So organization theorists in the systems school were very interested in how the organization relates with its external environment. So when we talk about the system school, we'll talk about two different approaches. We'll talk about closed system school versus open system school, the differences between the two, and a recognition of the fact that if we are in a public or nonprofit organization, chances are we are operating within very much of an open type of environment. Open environments mean that we have a lot of relationship between our organization and the external environment. A closed environment would mean that the organization kind of does its own thing in this silo without a lot of interaction with external elements. Another school of thought that we'll look at are our structural functional theorists. These relate very closely to our systems theorists. And so when we talk about people like Philip Selznick and Robert Merton, we're going to talk about them kind of in the same vein as our discussion of systems theory. We'll talk about the School of Quality Management with people like Deming and highlight why quality management sometimes does not work as well in the public sector as it does in the private sector. And then we will wrap up the show with a discussion of our more modern theories, theories such as organization culture and leadership theories. And what we'll do then kind of leave you with a sense of where the organization theory literature is today and where it has been for the past decade or two. So those are the schools of thought that we are going to work our way through in a chronological fashion over our next 4 weeks together. So that kind of gives you a little foundational introduction into public organization theory, what it is, and the different schools of thought that have been developed that are meant to try and help us study the structure and the behaviors and the interactions within our organizations and between our organizations and their external environments. But we are focusing in this class primarily on public organization theory. You can take an organization theory course over in the College of Business if you would like. That organization theory class in the College of Business, there is certainly nothing wrong with it. I'm sure it's a very good course, but it is obviously focused on private sector organizations. Public organization theory does have some inherent differences when compared to private organization theory. And some of these you've talked about before, and I'm sure you talked at length about some of these in your 500 course in your introduction to the study of public administration. And so if you harken back to your 500 course, I'm sure you are very familiar with the differences between public and private organizations in terms of power and authority. So, my first question to you tonight is how do public organizations differ from private organizations in terms of power and authority? And again, you can use text chat if you'd like to use your microphone, however you're comfortable participating. I leave it completely up to you. But how are public organizations different from private corporations when it comes to this first issue of power and authority? Bob says city councils and commissions. Yeah, you're talking. Yeah, exactly. You're talking about legal types of organizations, organizations that have a legal authority. Their authority comes from policies, comes from laws. So when we have the creation of a public organization, that public organization is created through enabling legislation. That enabling legislation is passed by a legislative body. The members of that legislative body are duly elected representatives of the people. So there is this kind of legal standing through enabling legislation that these organizations have. And these organizations, when they're implementing policies and programs, these are policies and programs that also come from enabling legislation. I gotta move a couple things around here. There we go. Let's see. Jared said public response, elected officials and community members have to follow the rule of law. Absolutely. And this is, again, one of the interesting aspects of the public sector, especially when we talk about public administrators, the bureaucrats who work in these organizations. As administrators, they are hired based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So even though they don't have a very obvious tether to the public, the tether to the public comes in the form of elected officials. So those elected officials really do serve as kind of the intermediary between public administrators and the voters. And so as administrators, we are held accountable by elected officials. Those elected officials are then held accountable to the voters through the ballot box. Jacob is exactly right. There is generally no profit incentive for public organizations, meaning power can be structured much differently. Our primary goal is not going to be to run a profit. By definition, as a public organization, unless we happen to be a government corporation or even maybe a GSE, a government-sponsored enterprise, other than those situations, for the most part, we are going to be nonprofit in our orientation. So our decisions are not going to be driven by profits. They're not going to be driven by the purchasing decisions being made by our customers. So that's a much different orientation. Erica is right with funding sources. Funding sources are much different between public and private organizations, and there are important implications that come along with that. So in a public organization, we get our funding from appropriations for the most part. I know that there's grant funding and there are other types of funding, but for the most part, the lion's share of our money comes from legally appropriated public taxpayer dollars. Private corporations get their funding from profits. So that means there is probably going to be a heightened emphasis placed upon efficiency in a private corporation, because if you are not being efficient and you are not providing a quality good that people are going to want to purchase, since there is so much competition, they're going to go elsewhere to purchase it. You're going to lose your profits and you're not going to have the resources you need to survive. Appropriations are much more stable. And so we can usually assume that next fiscal year, we're going to get a similar amount in appropriations than we got last fiscal year. We may get a little boost for cost of living adjustments and cost of doing business factors. But for the most part, we're going to still get essentially what we got last year. So it's a very stable source of funding. So there's perhaps a little bit less of an incentive placed upon being as efficient as possible to maintain those funding sources. And so those funding sources, because they are different, they then lead to different decision-making types of patterns between public and private organizations. Lizette says private organizations have more power and authority to make decisions. Public organizations respond to community and elected officials. That is true, that when we are looking within a public organization as a public administrator, we oftentimes have less control over what's going on in our organization than our private sector counterparts might have. We have less control because we have more regulations. So think about when you are dealing with employees in your organization. Those employees are probably going to be civil service employees, which means they have their civil service protections. So when we deal with those employees, we need to be very aware of those civil service protections and endeavor not to violate those civil service protections. Overlay on top of those civil service protections the fact that public employees tend to be unionized at a much higher level than their private sector counterparts. And we're talking about 3 times more likely to be unionized. If you look writ large across the country and all public employees at all different levels of government, public employees tend to be unionized at rates of about 35 to 40%. Private sector employees tend to be unionized more at a rate of about 10 to 12%. So it's about 3 times as much here in the public sector. So that means you also have to abide by the collective bargaining agreement. And all those CBA regulations are overlaid on top of civil service regulations. So I would agree, there are a lot more limitations on us as public administrators in how we can manage our resources, especially managing our employees. Eric says public organizations often have a wide variety of goals. They have multiple stakeholders as opposed to private corporations, which typically focus solely on profits. Our environment is absolutely much more varied than the environment that a lot of private corporations operate within. We do have multiple stakeholders. We have multiple stakeholders who have a variety of different resources to affect the policy and program process. We also have multiple stakeholders that have a variety of different vested interests. So it is a much more difficult environment that our public organizations have to navigate as opposed to what we tend to see with private sector corporations. The idea of having a variety of goals is also true as well. We do tend to have a multiplicity of goals when we create our strategic plans. Our strategic planning process also tends to be much more subject to interventions and interruptions than in the private sector. If we're working on our strategic plan and we're a public works department, and then we start having all of these storm sewer systems going offline because they're 90, 100 years old. We've got all these water main breaks, and those are emergency situations that we have to drop everything and respond to immediately. So we have to take that time and those energies away from our strategic planning process. So strategic planning and goal setting tends to be a lot more difficult in the public sector. Public was more mission-driven, transparency, and accountability, while private was market-driven with ownership. Absolutely agree with that. We are very mission driven and we have to be transparent. We have to be open to scrutiny from members of the public and also be open to scrutiny from our overseers, who are oftentimes those members of the legislature who are charged with overseeing our agencies. That amount of transparency is going to differ depending upon which state you are operating within. Here in California, we really favor transparency. And so we have some very generous public records laws here in the state of California. I mean, generous in terms of generous to members of the public. So it is relatively easy here in California for a member of the public to put in a Public Records Act request, a PRA as we usually call it. And when they put in that public records request, we then have to respond to that within 10 days. We don't have to maybe provide all the information requested within 10 days, but we have to at least respond to that request in 10 days. The member of the public, if they want to do it via an email, they can do it via email. If they want to use the form that's on the city website, they can do that. But there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how members of the public can gain insight into the processes and the documents that are being used by public organizations, which means that a lot of the resources in these public organizations will need to go to responding to these Public Record Act requests. I know I've experienced that when I was on a board, is that we would get a public records request. Sometimes that request would be for something that went back several years. And so it would go back in time so far that it would go beyond the current members of the board, would go beyond the current administrators in the district. And so you then have to scour all the communications that dealt with this specific topic or this specific contract over a multi-year period of time. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. Smaller organizations oftentimes don't have employees who are dedicated to responding to these public records requests. And so you're going to have another employee taking time from their normal job to go and respond to these types of requests. Let's see. I hope I don't miss anything here. Fabiola says public organizations answer to elected officials and the people, while private corporations answer to their owners and shareholders. We deal with this situation known as the principal agent relationship, which we'll talk about in a future slide. In this principal agent relationship, we are held accountable to elected officials, to legislative bodies. They are the overseers of what we do in our agencies. We have to respond to those elected officials. Private corporations, as Fabiola says, need to respond to their shareholders. So you have different types of oversight between the sectors. So we do have a lot of these types of differences that really suggest that perhaps we need to study public organizations a bit differently than how we study private organizations. I'll just pick up on transparency again really quickly. One of the positive aspects of transparency for those of us who study public organizations is that there's a lot more access to information. So we can get that information from a public organization that we could not have gotten from a private corporation. That public organization is going to be required to do audits, and sometimes multiple audits per year, oftentimes audits that are being done by external auditors. Vast majority of our local governments are going to produce their financial reports, and so they're going to produce their annual comprehensive financial report, which will detail and lay out there all their finances, their revenues and their expenditures and their liabilities and their assets, and all that is public information, and all that is public information that's usually readily available on that city's website. Good luck getting a lot of that same information from a private corporation. And so transparency does sometimes make it a little bit easier for us as students of public organization theory. So there are these differences in terms of authority between public organizations and private organizations. Public organizations at their very heart are governmental organizations. That means they are part of a government. Governments, in order to be a government typically has to have at least two common characteristics. The first characteristic of a government is that the government will have control over its jurisdiction. The second requirement for being a government is that it must have some type of coercive power and authority over its citizens. So governments need to have some coercive power that they can get their citizens to take actions they otherwise would not take. Sorry, I was working on a sneeze, but it went away. So I'll try and mute myself if I have to sneeze. So power, and I don't know how much you talk about power in 500. When I teach 500, I like to talk about power. And I like to talk about what power is and what power it is not. For our purposes here, power is essentially the ability to use resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. So if you have resources and you can use those resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, you are exercising power over that individual. So when you think about a government organization, governments have resources and they can use those resources to influence you to do something you might not want to do. So governments can influence you to serve on a jury. Normally, people would not want to serve on a jury, but they are coerced to serve on a jury through the coercive power of government. Paying taxes. You know, a lot of people, if they had their druthers, they would prefer not to pay income taxes. But there are punitive measures if you do not pay your income taxes. When you have a military draft, there are punitive measures for not registering for that draft. Even with selective service, there are punitive measures for not registering for selective service if you are a male when you hit the age of 18. So those are all examples of coercive authority that flow from government. Public organizations, because they are governmental institutions, have that type, or at least some element of that type of coercive authority. We already mentioned a major difference in terms of the environment. So when we study public organizations, we have to take into account it's much larger and it's much more varied external environment as compared to what a private corporation would operate within. Someone had mentioned, text chat correctly, the idea of goals, that we have multiple goals. Those multiple goals that we have in public organizations also tend to be what we refer to as softer goals. And as you know from your time in the program, in the public sector, it is oftentimes much more difficult for us to quantitatively measure the goals that we are achieving in the public sector. If you are going to have a goal of enhancing the quality of life of citizens in a community, we can develop some indicators to help us approximate quality of life, but that's a much more difficult goal to measure than in the private sector if you are running a widget factory. And you know, economists love to use widgets. That's their fake artificial commodity. And so you've got this wonderful factory that's producing these widgets. Well, their goal is to create the highest quality widget possible to enhance their sales, to enhance their profit. Those are very empirical measures. You can put hard and fast dollar values on it. You can monetize those measures much easier than you can monetize something like quality of life. A lot of our organization theories are going to be oriented around the idea of organizational effectiveness. So how can this theory help our organizations be more effective? Using whichever of those 4 miles of organizational effectiveness you are using in your theory. So if we're focusing on effectiveness and the effectiveness is achieving goals and we have difficulty measuring our goals, inherently we're going to have difficulty measuring effectiveness. And then it was also correctly mentioned in text chat, all the limitations on the action of public administrators in these public organizations. We have our legal limitations that we have already talked about. One that I will add to that is a legal limitation from this act known as the Anti-Deficiency Act. And I don't know if you've been introduced to that before, but the Anti-Deficiency Act is a really good way of distinguishing between public and private sector organizations. What the Anti-Deficiency Act says is that government organizations may only spend money on what they are legally allowed to spend money on, what is legally authorized. So you can only spend money on what is authorized in authorizing legislation. Private corporations, however, can spend money on anything that they want as long as that is not precluded by law. So as long as it's not illegal. So there are a lot of additional things that private corporations can spend their money on as compared to here in the public sector. Now, we see this Anti-Deficiency Act being an important topic again and again, and we've seen it in the first Trump administration, and we're seeing it again here in the second Trump administration. In the first Trump administration, the Anti-Deficiency Act was called into question when we had a government shutdown. And the government shutdown came on the heels of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act fundamentally was a whole-scale revamping of the federal income tax system. So what it did is it created different types of deductions. It limited the state and local tax deduction to $10,000. That has recently been lifted to $40,000 again, but then it was reduced to $10,000. It greatly increased the standard deduction to try and get people to file with the standard deduction rather than going through all the time and expense and effort of itemizing their deductions. So it made all these different changes. Problem was that the government shut down in January. Well, what are people starting to do in January? They're starting to file their federal income tax returns. So taxpayers are very confused about what they could and could not deduct and what credits they had and what credits they no longer had. And so they started calling the customer service department for the IRS. Well, nobody was answering the phone because all these IRS agents had been furloughed because of the government shutdown. So, because of the political blowback, the White House said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to just bring all those IRS agents back and we are going to pay them their salaries from other sources of revenue. Well, that was challenged because the Anti-Deficiency Act says you essentially can't do that. You have to spend money the way in which it's been legally appropriated by Congress. Well, since we had a government shutdown and we did not have an appropriation bill that had been passed for the Department of Treasury, there was no legal basis for paying those IRS agents. And eventually, what happened is the government shutdown ended relatively quickly after that because of the political pressure. But that's a good example of some of the limitations that we oftentimes struggle with in terms of what we can and cannot do as public organizations. The big difference here in terms of limitation are, of course, those political limitations. Well, when I used to teach budgeting, my favorite phrase I would use in my budgeting class is that political imperatives trump economic imperatives, meaning that if something makes political sense, that is more important oftentimes than it making economic sense. There could be a course of action that makes a great deal of sense economically, but if it doesn't make sense politically, it probably is not going to happen. So even though we are administrators working on the administrative side of the equation, we, as we all know, are still very heavily influenced by operating within a political environment. So public organizations are different, and so therefore we have to study those public organizations differently than we would study a private sector corporation. So if you were taking an organization theory course over in the College of Business and you were learning all these organization theories and all these organization models and then trying to just apply them in the public sector, you're going to run into some problems. As we had said before, not to belabor it too much, but you have different goals and objectives in the public as compared to the private sector. You also have this principal-agent relationship that I had mentioned earlier. And so in this principal-agent relationship, we as administrators in public organizations, our actions are being overseen by members of a legislative body, by elected officials. So in the principal-agent relationship, the elected officials, the members of Congress, they are the principals. We, as the members of the agency, as administrators, we are the agents. So the principals oversee the agents. You would think normally the principals who are overseeing the agents would have most of the information. They would have the information they need to properly oversee the actions of those agents. The fact of the matter is, we know that in a principal-agent relationship, there is a great deal of information asymmetry. And in that information asymmetry, who knows better what is going on a daily basis in the agency than those administrators who are implementing these policies and programs on that daily basis? So really, the information resides with the agent as opposed to the principal. That is problematic because what that does is that information asymmetry then creates this thing known as a moral hazard. The moral hazard for the administrator is deciding what and how much information they should provide to the elected officials in the oversight function. So should they give them all the information? Should they give them limited information? That moral hazard comes about because there is a disincentive to provide information to overseers. Because when you provide this information to members of Congress, you are giving them the information they need to more closely scrutinize your actions. So there's very much this disincentive. Now, when we go back to the 8 principles in the American Society for Public Administration's Code of Ethics, We know that one of those principles, I think it's number 5, is to fully inform and advise. So ethically, we are required to provide that information to elected officials, even though there's that disincentive for doing so. So the principal agent relationship in terms of oversight is very much flawed here in the public sector. In the private sector, it might be a little bit more straightforward than it may be here in the public sector. Quantifying outputs and outcomes, we've already mentioned that one. It's much more difficult for us to quantify and monetize what we are doing here in a public organization compared to what's being done by a private organization. And because of that, it becomes much more difficult for us to measure performance and then reward employees for their performance. If you are not sure how to measure your outputs and your outcomes, then you are not really sure what your goals are. If you are not sure what your goals are, then you're probably not sure how to achieve those goals. If you don't know how to achieve those goals, it's going to be difficult for you to measure someone's performance in their ability to achieve the goals. So performance measurement becomes very messy and very complicated here in the public sector. It also becomes very complicated in the public sector because of, as I said before, collective bargaining agreements. So just about any collective bargaining agreement that is worth its salt will have an article in it that discusses the performance evaluation process and lays out in pretty strict detail the performance evaluation process and how it should work. So we are very limited in the way in which we can measure performance, and we are even more limited in the way in which we can reward performance. Pay for performance, as we know, is a very common incentive that is used in the public sector. In the private sector, we don't see it used that much in the public sector for a variety of reasons. One reason is that public sector unions oftentimes are not big fans of pay for performance because they kind of see that pay for performance as being kind of that slippery slope. And so, since you can't do a lot of pay for performance in the public sector, if you have a private sector theory that is predicated on pay for performance, such as scientific management with Frederick Taylor, that's going to be more difficult for us to apply to our public organizations. So clearly, since private organization theories and models don't work that well in the public sector, it is then incumbent upon us to develop our own unique theories and models to apply to our public organizations. So I think that provides us with a justification for why we are doing this class here in an MPA program rather than just borrowing the organization class out of the College of Business. But even if we are looking only at public organizations, we still have a dilemma. And that dilemma is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to develop a panacea, one universal theory or model that will apply to every public organization. Because even within the public sector, we have a great deal of variation between our public organizations. Public organizations obviously differ greatly in terms of their size. We look at the federal level. We have some organizations that are extremely large, like the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Agriculture, very large organizations. We have some other federal organizations that are incredibly small. And I think it's still true. I don't know if it's still there. There have been so many changes to the federal bureaucracy over the past few months. It's kind of hard to keep up with it all. But there used to be this organization known as the Marine Mammal Conservation Commission, I think it was called. And it's this very small commission made up of, I believe it's 12 or 13 marine biologists. And so these are folks who have their PhDs in marine biology, very, very small type of organization. What works in terms of a theory or model for that commission is probably not going to work for a huge organization such as Health and Human Services. And the size of the organization has a lot of impact upon employees as well. Every year up until this year, and it's now gone and probably never going to come back again, but up until this year, every year the federal government would produce their Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And that was a survey that would go out to all federal employees across the entire federal government to assess their job satisfaction and to assess their motivation and their engagement with their positions. So I can see how motivated and how satisfied federal employees are. And it was really a fascinating study because uh, it put together a lot of different indices and a lot of details. But the one thing that it did that's important for us is that it would break down agencies according to their size. So it would have one category for very large organizations that are, I believe it's over 10,000 employees, then large organizations, medium organizations, small organizations, and very small organizations. There was a strong correlation between job satisfaction and the size of the organization, in that the smaller the organization, the more satisfied federal employees were working in that organization. So the size of the organization really does make a difference. Differing structures. We know that some organizations are these tall hierarchies. Some other organizations are much flatter in terms of their hierarchical shape. A tall hierarchy that has one singular director or secretary at the top of the organization chart, and then in this pyramidal type of shape, as you go down the organization chart, you encounter more and more positions so that the plurality of your positions are at the bottom level of your organization chart. Those types of tall hierarchies need to be managed differently than a flatter hierarchy, such as a commission. So you have a commissioner form of government, kind of like our LA County Board of Supervisors. You have multiple people who are supervisors. You have five different supervisors. They are equal, and at least theoretically, they are equal in terms of their power. And so it's a much flatter type of hierarchy. Those need to be managed much differently than a tall hierarchy. You also have some organizations that are very centralized in terms of their functions, and that all their functions are centralized into one physical location. Then you have some other organizations at the federal level, such as the Department of Agriculture, that maintains field offices all across the country. So that's a very decentralized, fragmented type of organization structure. A few months ago, the director of the FBI announced that he wanted to take apart the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and move all these agents out into regional and field offices all over the country. That didn't work all that well and kind of backed off that relatively quickly when he kind of realized the type of information that the FBI deals with. And sometimes with that confidential information, that's information that needs to be discussed in a very secure environment. And you don't want to be doing it over the internet. So it's something you want to be doing in a SCIF, in a room in the FBI headquarters. And so the FBI has kind of stayed a little bit more centralized than what the original intent would have been with the new director. Differing functions. We have some organizations that are in direct administration. We have some organizations that are engaged in indirect administration. Direct administration, those are your street level bureaucrats, as Michael Lipsky would say. Those are the administrators who are interfacing directly with citizens and providing those services directly to those citizens. That's a direct administration. Other agencies, typically at the state or at the federal level, those tend to be more engaged in indirect administration, in that they may not be interacting directly with those citizens on a daily basis, but they are instead providing the resources that will then make the direct administration possible by other agencies. So differing functions. Some of our agencies deal with some very sensitive classified information in terms of their functions that they engage in, while others do not. So that will have an impact upon the sharing of information. Differing environments, we've already mentioned this, but just one more issue here to put a finer point on it. Environments have differing capabilities to support their organizations. Some environments do not have the capability to support an organization. Some environments have the capability, but they don't have the inclination to support those organizations. So if you find your organization in an environment that does not have the inclination or the capability to support your organization, Obviously, your theories are going to have to focus more on own source revenue. You're going to have to be going out there and developing your own revenue, whether it be through grants or whatever the case may be. You're going to have to go out there and try and develop your own labor pool because your environment is not able to provide it for you. Some environments are very challenging and dynamic in nature, and some are more static. If you're in a very changing type of environment, then the theory or the model that may have worked for you yesterday may not work equally as well today. A great example of that at the federal level would be the education department. Think about the environment the education department dealt with we'll say 3 years ago, compared to the environment it's dealing with now. We have seen major rifts at the Department of Education. We have seen some of the portfolio of the types of programs that are managed by the Department of Education being farmed out to other agencies, all in preparation for winding down the operations of the Department of Education. That's a good example of a very challenging and changing environment, and an environment that no longer has the inclination, at least politically, to support that type of an organization. Different types of employees. Different organizations will have different employees with different training and different background. For many years, this distance learning program, we had different work sites. And so way back in the day when I first started teaching this program, which was 25 years ago, we actually delivered these courses through closed circuit. And so what I would do is I would trudge my way up to upper campus and go into the university studio. And I had a producer there, excellent producer. She moved on a few years after we moved to the online environment. But I would literally be in a studio. She would count me down. I'd be kind of at a news desk, and we would do through closed circuit TV to each of our physical work sites. And then members of the cohort would then just crowd around a table in the conference room at OCTA or at DPW, and that's how they would then attend their classes. So when we were dealing with our students at OCTA, the vast majority of our DLMPA students at OCTA, they were engineers. When we were dealing with a more social service organization like Public Social Services, we were dealing with people with a background in human services. So those are different types of employees that have different backgrounds and kind of approach organizations and understanding organizations a little bit differently. And then finally, public organizations also have different types of technologies that they employ. And one of my favorite alliterative terms that I get to use in any of the classes is this alliterative term known as Thompson's typology of technology. I love alliteration. So Thompson's typology of technology. So Thompson tells us in his typology of technology that there are three main types of technologies that are used by organizations. I'll put all this in text yet. The first type of technology that an organization can use is what's called a log-linked technology. So in a log-linked technology, you think about it as kind of like you've got these like if you go to a water park and you ride a log ride, and you know that each log is a different ride to accommodate different people, and they're all connected to each other. That's a log-linked technology. That one log follows the other log that follows the log before it. So from an organizational perspective, think about an assembly line in a factory. So if you're working on an assembly line, you're working at a auto plant, and your job is to put the headlights in. So when the car comes down the assembly line, you install the headlight. Then the next person is going to install the grill, and then the next person installs the bumper. That is a log-linked technology, that the work of each person is going to be based upon the work of the person who came before them on the assembly line. That is a relatively simple type of an approach, and again, it's most appropriate for a factory assembly line type of setting. But in the public sector, we have other types of technologies that we use. And the second type of technology, according to Thompson, is a mediating technology. In a mediating technology, the public administrator's job is to connect the beneficiary with the resources that beneficiary needs. And so think here about an employment bureau. So if you're working in an employment bureau, your job is to, whenever people come in looking for work, you connect them with resources that will help them find a job. Whether that may be, a computer literacy training, or maybe some listing of childcare facilities, or other types of training programs. You are being that mediator between the person and the resources that will help them get that job. So that's a mediating type of technology. The third type of technology is the one that we use most frequently in our public organizations, and that's what's known as an intensive technology. In an intensive technology, administrators are dealing directly with individual citizens, individual beneficiaries, who have separate sets of wants, needs, and desires. And so, how you deal with person A may need to be different than how you deal with person B and person C and person D. So, the technologies that you are using in satisfying these beneficiaries will differ depending upon the situation in which you are working. That's what he calls the intensive type of technology. So here in a lot of our public organizations, we are dealing with an intensive type of technology, which means that there cannot be a one size fits all approach. That the approach you use for one person will probably not work equally well for every other person that you are dealing with in the organization. If, however, you're in a log linked type of technology, a one size fits all approach might work well. And so, a lot of these classical one size fits all theories that we're going to look at this semester, they were developed for private corporations that were working with a log linked technology, which means they worked well in that situation. But then when we took them and we tried to apply them into our public organizations, they didn't work as well because we have a different type of technology that we are using. So even within the public sector, different public organizations can have different sizes, structures, functions, environments, employees, and technologies that they implement. So one of the themes that ties our entire 150-year evolution of the organization theory literature together is this theme of moving away from the search for a universal answer and instead realizing that there can never be a one size fits all approach. And the models and theories we develop are much more contextual in nature. They must be developed to fit the contours and the context of the situation we are dealing with in that specific organization at that specific point in time. And so, just keep that in mind because as we go through our evolution, that's going to be that one thread that kind of runs through the entire development of the organization theory literature. So now that we've kind of established the need for the development of public organization theories, now we can talk a little bit more about how we are going to analyze all those different theories and schools of thought over our next several weeks together. And I foreshadowed this for you when we met for that hour on Saturday as the second main reason why I like using the Tompkins textbook. And this is why we kind of brought him out of retirement for the new version of the textbook. And that is that we are going to compare all of our theories on these three main characteristics. What models of organizational effectiveness those theories use, what methods for control and coordination are used by those theories, and what motivational strategies are emphasized by those theories. I like doing this because it does give us that ability to compare our theories to each other. So let's start with these four models of organizational effectiveness that we are going to be using this semester. So I presented those to you very quickly on Saturday. If you have the book, they're on page number 28, at least in the paper copy of the book. I assume that the page numbers are relatively similar in the digital version. And on page 28, you get this Exhibit 3.1. And this is what's called the Competing Values Framework, which presents to us the four models of organizational effectiveness. So this is a matrix in which the four different models are differentiated on two main characteristics. And you'll see in the matrix, we have a y-axis and we have an x-axis. So on the vertical y-axis, these theories are going to be differentiate between whether or not they favor flexibility and adaptation for the organization, or whether they favor an emphasis on top-down control and centralization. So the models that are at the bottom of the matrix are going to favor control and more centralization. The ones at the top are going to favor flexibility and adaptation. Then your x-axis, which is on your horizontal, that then runs the spectrum from an external to an internal focus. So those models on the right side of the matrix are going to emphasize the external focus. Those on the left side are going to emphasize the internal focus. So based upon those two dimensions, it allows us then to break our models up into the four different cells in the matrix. The ultimate goal here is to have our organization develop our organizations in such a way in which they are producing a quality output that will result in the types of outcomes, the consequences that are called for in our enabling legislation that will meet our mission and our goals as the organization. So for these four different models, we'll just randomly start with the human relations model. That's at the top left of the matrix. Since it's in the top left-hand cell, it means it's at the top of the chart, which means it favors flexibility and adaptation. And it's on the left side of the chart, which means that it has an internal focus. And you'll see as you look at the human relations model, your ultimate goal, what you are trying to achieve here is you are trying to achieve human resource development. You're trying to put together a system in your organization where you can help your employees develop their skills and their abilities to develop as human resources. The function in this model is this pattern maintenance function, the need to maintain a competent, integrated, and dedicated workforce. You can maintain that competent and dedicated and integrated workforce by providing them with these opportunities to develop as human resources. So that is your human relations model. So for instance, the human resource management school is going to fit directly within this human relations model of effectiveness. So you are defining the effectiveness of your organization as the organization's ability to help develop their employees for the purpose of creating this competent and dedicated and integrated workforce. So you're really looking at the employees within your organization. The one below it is the internal process model of effectiveness. So here, effectiveness is going to be defined by looking within the organization at the processes and the procedures that go on within the organization. So through the use of information management and management of communication, you will create a system of stability and control where the work activities are coordinated and the work activities are controlled to help you then create your quality output. But the focus here is we are effective as an organization if we have effective procedures and processes. So that's our primary measure of effectiveness in the internal process model. At the top right, you have the open systems model. The open systems model is at the top of the matrix, meaning that it favors flexibility. And it's on the right side, which means it's looking external to the organization. So the open systems model, our primary goal is to adapt to an uncertain environment for the purpose of acquiring resources and growing as an organization. In order to acquire resources and to grow as an organization, we need to be adaptable and need to be flexible to our external environment. So the open systems model, we are defining effectiveness as the ability of the organization to acquire necessary resources from its external environment, because those necessary resources will then help this organization grow and survive. So ultimately, we want to get these resources for our organization to survive. So agency survival is one of our primary goals. And so if we have an organization that has the resources it needs, it's able to grow, it's able to support itself, that's an effective organization. And then the bottom right cell, the final cell, you have your rational goal model. This one's at the bottom, which favors control. It's on the right side, so it favors more of an external focus. Here we are looking at an effective organization is an organization that is able to attain its goals. So how well the organization achieves its goals, that is our measure of organizational effectiveness. So what we are going to do is we're going to engage in strategic planning. We're going to engage in goal setting. We're going to engage in trying to enhance productivity in achieving those goals because at the end of the day, we are effective as an organization when we have made progress toward and hopefully achieved the goals that we have established as an organization. So those are our 4 models of organizational effectiveness. And as we finish our discussion of each one of our schools, we are going to then go back to these models of organizational effectiveness to see where those theories of those schools fall within these 4 cells of these models of organizational effectiveness. The way in which Tompkins does it, you'll see in future chapters, is that he will shade in the cell if he feels that that is a model of effectiveness that is being represented by this theory that we have discussed. 2 things I'll point out to you just as kind of a points of caution as we move forward. I don't always agree with Tompkins. He would be fine with that, but I don't always agree with him. And so when I disagree with Tompkins, I will let you know that I disagree with Tompkins. The second thing is one of the flaws in this book is that I wish that when he would shade in the cells, there would be an ability to shade the cells in kind of a gradual fashion, in that those models that are truly represented by this theory would be shaded in darker than those that are less represented by the theory. Because again, there's a lot of gradation that is involved in how these models are represented in the theories that we will discuss. Unfortunately, here it's kind of a binary, either it's shaded in or it's not. But I will highlight to you when I think that there is a little bit of gradation there in terms of which models are being represented. So that's that first criteria that we're going to use to compare our theories. Then the second model, and that model, those models, the competing values framework, if you want some people to associate with that, Quinn and Rohrbach are oftentimes the ones that are most closely associated with that competing values framework. Then for the second criteria, we're looking at the mechanisms that the organization should use to coordinate and control work that goes on within the organization. And these 6 mechanisms come to us from Mintzberg. So they're Mintzberg's mechanisms for coordination and control. So Mintzberg tells us that the first possible method for coordinating and controlling work is what he refers to as mutual adjustment. Mutual adjustment is when you consult with employees to kind of involve them in the way in which work is being done. So it's not necessarily just this top-down type of an approach. You are communicating with them, you are asking them their thoughts and kind of involving them in the process. More of a human resource management type of an approach. So that's one way we can control and coordinate work with the assistance and the involvement of our employees. The second way is through direct supervision, which doesn't take a whole lot of explanation. We know what direct supervision is. It's those top-down commands. When you've got direct supervision, these types of top-down commands, you're probably going to be talking more about a classical type of theory. So here you have to tell employees what to do. You have to directly control what they're doing on a daily basis. Then the next 4 are all based upon standardization. So the third one is standardization of work processes. So we can control and coordinate the work that's being done in the organization by standardizing similar work processes. So everyone who's doing the same job will kind of have this one standard way of doing the job. So think about application processing. So if you're in an HR office and your job is to process applications, and someone else is in the same position as you as an HR analyst, analyzing and processing these applications, we would kind of have a standardization for the way in which we do that. When we look at applications to academic programs, we have a standardization of those types of processes. Standardization of work outputs, so that the outputs, the products we are creating are standardized, that they are all relatively equivalent to each other. So that would be something like the School of Quality Management that we'll talk about in a few weeks. Standardization of worker skills, making sure that all the employees who are doing a job have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to do their jobs. So we standardize the required skills of workers in similar positions. And then standardization of values. We try to standardize the values of the organization, hoping that by standardizing these values, it will then become very transparent and very clear to everyone what that set of values is for that organization. And again, that's being done to, again, try and help enhance the coordination and control of the work that's being done. But these six are all mechanisms for trying to coordinate and control the work that's done in the organization on a daily basis. So that is our second criteria. And then our third and final criteria are these motivational strategies. And we have four different motivational strategies that we're going to be looking at. The first one is legal compliance. So in legal compliance, we establish these rules and we expect that people will adhere strictly to these rules. If employees do not adhere and comply with these rules, then there will be punitive measures that they will have to face. There will be penalties. So everyone has to be at work, at their desk, with their computer on, ready to work at 9 a.m. Monday through Friday. That is a requirement that people are being held to comply with. That's a very obviously classical type of approach to an organization theory. Second way in which we motivate people is through instrumental rewards. And this is where it gets to be a little bit more nuanced. Instrumental rewards can consist of different types of things. One type of instrumental reward, the most basic kind, is a performance-based reward. So based upon someone's performance, we will motivate them to achieve higher levels of performance by offering them pay for performance if we can, bonus pay. If we can't do that, then we'll offer them recognition, maybe Employee of the Week or Employee of the Month. As we will see as we cover some of our transactional theories like Chester Barnard, it is important that supervisors, if they are going to provide these types of instrumental rewards, they understand how much individual employees value each one of these rewards. Because obviously, if you're providing a reward of Employee of the Week to an employee who doesn't care one bit about being Employee of the Week, you're not going to be motivating that employee. So you've got your performance rewards. You also have another instrumental reward known as considerate leadership. Considerate leadership is kind of the human resources approach of listening to employees, treating employees well, paying attention to the wants, needs, and desires of those employees. That is kind of an intrinsic type of motivating factor for higher levels of productivity. Third one is group acceptance, understanding that groups exist within organizations and not getting rid of those informal groups, but actually supporting those informal groups. People sometimes like to work in groups, and sometimes the results of working in groups are that collective effort is going to exceed individual effort. So accepting and fostering these groups within the organization, that can be a motivating factor. Elton Mayo told us organizations are social environments. These groups are a natural part of those social environments. The third motivational strategy is job identification. Again, this comes primarily out of the Human Resource Management School. In job identification, we are allowing employees to help design their jobs so they can identify with those jobs. So, for instance, if you have an employee in your city who one day aspires to be a city manager, you might want to incorporate in their job description the ability to float or rotate around different departments within the city. By rotating, they obviously can get a little taste of what the Parks Department does, a little taste of what Public Works does, a little taste of what the city manager's office does, and so on and so on, so that that will give them the insight they need to help to develop as a human resource to then eventually move into a city manager position. If they have those abilities to enhance their skill sets in their jobs, they're going to be much more likely to identify with those jobs. The more they identify with what they're doing on a daily basis, the more motivated they probably will be. And then the fourth motivational strategy is goal congruence or goal agreement. If we can find the point at which individual goals can become congruent and kind of come to that point of confluence with organizational goals, that is where we can motivate employees. That if employees can see how the goal of the organization can help them achieve their own individual goal, then obviously they are going to be more motivated and more productive employees. So for each one of these theories and schools of thought, we will also then go back on this third criteria and see which of these four motivational strategies are really highlighted within each one of those theories or schools of thought that we will talk about. As I told you on Saturday, I like this approach because I think it is far superior to me just throwing a whole bunch of theories at you, you memorizing theories. I don't think there's a whole lot of utility in that. Instead, I think it's important that we analyze those theories. And so, to do a good job of analyzing these theories, we are going to use these three criteria for each theory that we talk about in the course. So, in these past 90 minutes, essentially, I've talked a lot, and I know that, and I apologize for it, but it's given us kind of our introductory foundational understanding of what organization theory is, why we study public organizations differently, and why we have a different body of literature on public organizations, and then finally, how we as a class are going to analyze all these different theories and schools of thought over this 150-year evolution of public organization literature. So, based upon what we have discussed before we take a break, and we're right up to our break time now, does anyone have any questions, any clarifications, or observations on any of this information up to this point in time? Okay, if not, everybody ready for a break? Because I know I am. So let's go ahead and take a break until 7:45. Come on back at 7:45, and then I will show you the breakout exercise that we're going to do. I will go ahead and create our breakout rooms and assign you randomly into a breakout room. Then we'll spend about 30 or so minutes in those breakout rooms. We'll then reconvene as a class. The spokesperson for each room can then share out what each room came up with. We'll look for the similarities and differences. Then we'll take a look at the clock and we'll see where we are time-wise. If we don't have time left, we'll just call it a night at that point. If we do have time remaining, then we might start to work forward into classic organization theories, but we will deal with that bridge when we come to it. So go ahead and take a break. Come back at 7:45 and we'll do our breakout rooms. It's 7:45, so we are back. Let's take a look at the breakout rooms. So what we'll be doing is I'll again create the breakout rooms in just a second here, and I'll randomly assign folks in the breakout rooms. Given the number of people we have here tonight, I'll probably, I think, probably go with three rooms. I think we'll try that for tonight. And what I want each room to do is to discuss your organizations. And so essentially, we may have some people work in similar organizations or the same organization, but theoretically, I'm assuming that you'll have a variety of organizations within your room. So discuss your organizations and identify two characteristics, two common characteristics. So characteristics that are common to your organizations that would make it difficult to apply private organization theories to study your organization. So you'll draw upon these differences that we've talked about tonight, but make sure you identify two characteristics that are common to all of your organizations within your group that would make it difficult to apply private organization theories to study your organization. So that's what we're going to be doing. I also ask that each one of our rooms select a spokesperson because we'll work on this for about half an hour or so. I'll leave you alone as you work in your breakout rooms because I don't want to get in there and kind of mess up your discussion. So I'm going to let you go ahead and discuss it for about 30 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning. I'll give you a 2-minute warning. And then when I close the rooms, we'll all come back together automatically into this main room. And then each spokesperson for each group will then share out what your group came up with. And then we'll kind of compare what our different rooms came up with and look for some similarities or some differences. So let me go ahead and create our breakout rooms. So let's do 3 of them and see what that looks like. Okay. All right, so I've created 3 rooms and just randomly assigned folks to rooms. So as soon as I open the rooms, you're free to then go into your assigned breakout room. And again, I will let you know when we are getting close to the end of our 30 minutes in our breakout room exercise so that we can come together and reconvene as a class and see what you came up with. Sound good? Okay. Let me open the rooms and then you are free to go. There we go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we are all back in the main classroom now. All the breakout rooms are closed. So let's go ahead and check in with each spokesperson for each group and see what each group came up with. So let's start with what I have as room number 1. I think that was Angelica, Ashley, Barb, Eric, Jacob, Jared.
Yeah, I'm the spokesperson for our group, and just, I guess, for background's sake, everyone in our group was either working for a city, a county, or higher education. I think all the elements, we kind of touched on all the elements, but the most recurring ones that kept popping up was measurements of success. So obviously, since we're a public agency, right? Either a nonprofit, we're not for profit, right? So how do we measure success? Is that, and that's very dependent on what department you're in as well too, right? So depending on your goals, what is your goals? Like, for instance, my department, one measurement of success is quality of life. How do we measure that, right? Do we send out a survey for that? Do we, how does that work? Or does that mean we just get more parks or other things like that too? So measurements of success is very different, as opposed to a private agency where it's, they're driven by profits, right? Are you making revenue, essentially? So it's very different and very dependent on your organization. And then also power and authority, right? So private organizations, depending how large you are, you kind of have a pretty classical hierarchy, right? You have your CEO or whatnot. Or within that CEO, within that corporation, you kind of have your boards that you respond to as well. But when you're talking about a public agency, you have, city council members that you have to respond to, board of supervisors, and it's just like how you were describing it early on, right? It's the community members are tethers to those, to those elected officials. So you're kind of you respond to more than just your local elected officials. You're also responding to your residents as well too. So those were the 2 main ones that we, talked about the most.
Thank you, room number 1. And yeah, we do. It goes beyond, even though we talk about the principal agent relationship, it goes beyond just being responsive to elected officials. In that one of those resources in an open systems model of effectiveness that we can generate from our external environment is constituent support. And so if we can develop that constituent support, develop that citizen support, that is then support that can then be brought to bear onto elected officials whenever it comes time for appropriation season or something like that. So I think that's an excellent point. And yet, quality of life, there are ways in which we can measure it, but it is kind of a difficult measurement. Like you said, we can send out surveys, we can have different indicators on those surveys, but it is much more difficult to measure quality of life than, as you said, just generation of profit. And so I do think that all that does recommend to us the need for separate, distinct public organization theories. So perfect. Thank you very much. Let's see what room two came up with. I think that's Alexandra. And go ahead.
Uh, Hi. So for room two, first, I thought that we were supposed to come up with two characteristics for each of our orgs, and then my group told me no, it's just two characteristics that all of our orgs have in common. And so what we came up with is our orgs are not profit driven, they're mission driven. So our goals are very broad and kind of far reaching, more abstract. It's not as simple as just focusing on the bottom line. Um, and our second characteristic that we talked about is in the public sector, you're accountable to the public, and your actions and your organization is under scrutiny from the public versus in the private sector, the organization's accountable pretty much only to, the CEO or whoever's at the top. And we also talked about some of the same things that Room One talked about, that metrics for outcomes are hard to measure. Like if you're providing a service in the public sector or private sector, I mean, versus in the public sector, you're trying to just improve the quality of life for your constituents. How do you measure that? It's not very straightforward. And then we also talked about the differences in technologies, um, like more intensive technologies in the public sector versus log doing technologies, assembly line kind of manufacturing strategies in the private sector, is also another difference. And these are the reasons that we said private organization theories wouldn't really apply to our public organizations.
Right. Kevin, thanks for too. Agree with all those points, and we are going to see overlap between the groups in terms of answers, and that's natural and that's expected. The one thing I do want to pick up on is the idea of metrics and the ability or inability to measure metrics for performance. And you're right, this is something we struggle with mightily in the public sector. And if we do citizen satisfaction surveys. And those citizen satisfaction surveys can at least, show us how satisfied our citizens are with the level and the types of services that they are receiving. But you can only go so far with the citizen satisfaction survey. And again, anytime you have surveys, as we know from research methods, it can sometimes be difficult for us to quantify those results, especially if they're more open-ended types of questions. And so I do think that is a major struggle that we have in the public sector. And most, as we'll see, when we talk about the evolution of these theories, some of the theories that we'll talk about do come from the private sector. But what we have done is we've taken those private sector theories and we have tried to modify them and tweak them, for lack of a better term, in order to make them better match our public organizations. But one of those areas that's very difficult for us to tweak is when we have a private organization theory that is predicated upon measurement of success in terms of very measurable metrics, because we oftentimes lack those despite our best efforts here in the public sector. So, okay, good job. And I think we only have one group left, and that is room number three.
Hi, I'm Ashna Go for a group. So for our group, we work, some of us work in nonprofits. A lot of us work for social services, either for a city or for a county. And then another one, some of us also work in education, so either at a school district or in higher education. Um, just like our previous colleagues, like it's hard to have measurable success, especially if we're social services driven. But a lot, we had big constraints as the private sector's budgets, especially right now since it's June, it's end of the fiscal year. Um, there's a lot of state regulations of how we can spend the money and then when can we spend the money. And also, even if we need more money, it has to be grant driven and it has to be dispersed or it has to be seen by a board of some sort. Unlike the private sector, they have revenue. If they need to spend money to get more money or even to be more efficiently, they could do that easily. Whereas the public sector, it has to go through so many proper channels. And even if it goes through those proper channels, it might take maybe 3 months, 6 months until you're able to spend that money or even get what you need for your organization. I think that was like um, one of the big things that we did talk about.
Thank you, Ashley. That's a great point. That and sometimes we kind of overlook that California has an interesting way in which they fund public organizations. And as we know, we have a budget bill that gets passed by the state legislature by June 15th, needs to be signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. And so, as you said, we're here in June now, and so we're at the end of our fiscal year, getting ready for the beginning of the next fiscal year. But even when that budget is passed and signed by the governor and that new fiscal year begins, as you point out, we oftentimes, as local agencies, don't have a lot of guidance in terms of how that money should be spent, in terms of the regulations, the requirements in spending that money. Here in California, as you probably know, once the fiscal year begins, we then end up having these trailer bills that then get passed by the state legislature after the budget has already gone into effect. So a lot of local governments, I know the district I used to be in, we would actually wait to spend the money because we would not have those trailer bills and have that trailer bill language to tell us exactly how we spend that money. So we would wait until those relevant trailer bills are passed so we know exactly how we're spending, how we're supposed to spend the money. And oftentimes, a lot of this money that we receive from the state government comes in the form of reimbursements. And so you have to spend local funds first, and then those local funds get reimbursed by the state. The longer it takes for those trailer bills to come out and provide us with the details on those reimbursements, the longer it takes for us to get those reimbursements. And oftentimes, those reimbursements that we get from state and federal government are only a fraction of what we really should be getting. A great example of that is in terms of federal money for special education programs. Typically, that is reimbursed at about a 40% rate. So local districts are getting about 40% of the special education money they're supposed to be getting from the federal government. So that is certainly a very big limitation to what we can do, how we can do it, and when we can do it as public organizations that really does set us very much apart from the private sector. A lot of these private sector theories are kind of predicated on the idea of unlimited access to resources and that you have the resources you need in order to do all these things that you're being told to do in the theory. Where in the public sector, we just simply lack those resources. And it's just not monetary resources. We lack the time, we lack the labor force. And so sometimes we just don't have what we need to put into practice a lot of these private sector organization theories. And so, in the public sector, we're always told we have to do more with less. And so I think that's kind of the theme of organization theory as well. We develop these theories, but when we apply them to public organizations, we need to realize that these theories need to be something that's actionable with very limited resources. And so I think all those limitations are very important, especially from a budgetary perspective. So. Okay, well done. Thank you for all three groups. Again, the whole idea of doing these breakout rooms, the idea is twofold. The first idea is to afford you the opportunity to work with different people in the cohort because you're still relatively early on in the cohort, so it's good that you work together and get to know each other very well because you're going to be working with each other for 22 months. And so that's number one. Number two is the application part of it that we know we are in an MPA program, we are both a scholarly as well as a professional program. And as a professional program, we need to take these theories that can sometimes be relatively esoteric in nature and be able to apply these theories and concepts in a practical setting in our public organizations. And so all of our discussion board posts, your organizational analysis paper, these breakout rooms that we do, they're all geared toward taking the information that we cover in class and then applying it practically to our organizations. And so that's what we're trying to achieve then with these breakout rooms. So thank you very much for that. Looks like it's about 8:40. I would propose that we just we cut it here for tonight. I really kind of hate to move into classical theory before you've had a chance to do the readings and also to move into it and then have to just kind of stop abruptly. So let's stop there for tonight. And then when we get together again on Monday, we will turn our attention to classic School of Organization theory. We'll talk about Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Fayle and Mooney and Gulick. And again, as we talk about all those different theories, we'll then relate them back to the three criteria in Tompkins. Once we finish that discussion, then we will also do another breakout room exercise. And I think that probably will take us through our entire time for our Monday session. Now, again, the Monday session is unusual. And so, as I said in the syllabus and told you on Saturday, if you are not able to attend on Monday, that is absolutely fine. It is optional. The session will be recorded, and then you can go back and watch the recording. And then I am always available to answer any questions you may have once you have watched that recording. Then also please remember on Monday the 15th, that's when you have your first Canvas essay that is due. So what you'll be turning in for that Canvas essay is a response to my initial prompt and then responses to two of your classmates. Those three posts for Canvas essay number 1 would then all need to be posted no later than midnight on June the 15th. Okay. Any questions or anything else before we call it an evening?
Professor, sorry, you mentioned we have to respond by the 15th as well?
Yes. Yeah. I need all three of the posts done by midnight on the 15th. So if you can do your initial post a little bit earlier than that, that then is helpful because then people have something to respond to.
Yeah, that's what I was like worried
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Professor, I do have a question. I was just curious, when would you usually post the recordings to Canvas?
I usually get the recordings up on Canvas the next day. So I would say probably by about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, it should be up there and should be available.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, yeah, I'll get this recording up by tomorrow. I look forward to reading your Canvas essay number 1 post, and then we'll be back at it for our optional session next Monday, looking at classic organization theory. So have a great remainder of the week, and I will talk to you again then on Monday. So take care.
Thank
Okay.
you. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.